So now we're moving in and focusing on our aerobic respiration steps. So we're going to start by kind of introducing this aerobic respiration, and then we'll break it down into the different categories of reactions. So then we'll talk about glycolysis, oxidation of pyruvate, et cetera, et cetera. So first, let's look at the overall equation. So I'm actually going to draw a couple of arrows here, because one arrow doesn't really do this justice. There are actually dozens of reactions that happen between the left side of the arrow and the right side of the arrow. But this is the overall reaction in the sense of what has to go into the reactions in order to make ATP, and then what do we get out of them. All right, so we're going to start by looking at our C6H12O6. So this is our glucose, which is a sugar. And we use glucose as kind of like a model molecule because glucose molecules go through every single step of aerobic respiration. But later on, we're going to talk about how glucose, remember, is not the only molecule that we can get energy from. So really, we're using glucose as just kind of an example, but really this could be any sort of organic nutrient. All right, so this could refer to other carbs, so other sugars, things like starch, fructose, sucrose. It could refer to our lipids, so our fats and oils, or it could refer to our proteins. So we can actually take all of these and put them through these reactions of cellular respiration. It's just that other carbs, lipids, and proteins don't necessarily go through every single step of cellular respiration. They just go through some of them. So we'll talk about that a little bit more later. The other thing we need are some oxygen molecules. So O2 just stands for oxygen. And then the outputs or the products are going to be our carbon dioxide. So our CO2 is carbon dioxide. H2O is water. And then our energy is going to be our ATP molecules. All right, but as I mentioned, this isn't just one reaction that happens. There are dozens of reactions that happen between the left side of the arrow and the right side of the arrow. And as I mentioned on a previous slide, there are 4 main steps to cellular respiration. So glycolysis happens first, followed by the oxidation of pyruvate, which is also called the transition reaction, followed by the citric acid cycle, which back in my day was actually called the Krebs cycle. But they've updated the name because the new name actually makes a lot more sense because it tells you a little bit about what's happening in that cycle because there is citric acid involved. And then the 4th step is going to be our oxidative phosphorylation, which has these kind of 2 sub-steps to them of the electron transport chain and chemiosmosis. When you learned about cell organelles, you probably learned that the mitochondria is the organelle or structure needed for ATP synthesis. And that is absolutely true if we're talking about aerobic respiration. So this kind of diagram here, it's showing you the cytosol, which remember can also be called the cytoplasm. And then we have our mitochondrion here. And so we're going to be talking about these kind of different locations. So first of all, that glycolysis reaction is happening in the cytoplasm. The other reactions that we talked about, so the oxidation of pyruvate, the citric acid cycle, which I guess I should label that here, and then the oxidative phosphorylation is all happening in the mitochondrion. So let's take a little bit of a closer look at the structure of a mitochondrion. So I'm going to draw just a big circle for our cell. All right, so we'll say that this is the cell membrane here. And I'm not going to draw this to scale because the mitochondria are obviously very small, but I'm going to draw it kind of big just so we can label the different parts of it. So this big kind of oval inside is going to be our mitochondrion. And we can kind of draw a little squiggly line inside. All right, so all in all, this whole thing here is the mitochondrion. And mitochondrion is just singular for mitochondrion. Plural would be mitochondria. So that's the difference there. So out here, kind of between the outside of the mitochondria, but inside the cell membrane, we have our cytosol, which remember is also called the cytoplasm. Or we can call it the intracellular fluid. So it's just the goo inside the cell. And our glycolysis reactions are happening out here. Now, the mitochondrion itself has a couple of different regions. So it has an outer membrane, it has an inner membrane, and this inner membrane, you'll notice, is folded. And so the folds are actually known as cristae. And the reason why it's folded is it helps to increase surface area. This is something you see a lot in biology. So more surface area usually means more room for chemical reactions. And so this is especially important because this is where the electron transport chain is located. So we can actually kind of draw the electron transport chain is basically made up of these kind of transmembrane proteins. So these integral proteins that allow different substances to kind of cross over that membrane. And so the more surface area we have, the more room we have for these electron transport chains. All right, so this is the electron transport chain. Now, inside the inner membrane, we have something called the matrix. All right, so the matrix is kind of the gooey filled center of the mitochondria. And then the area between the inner and outer membranes are called the intermembrane space. So what happens is glycolysis happens out in the cytosol, like we mentioned before already. And then the products of glycolysis actually go into the matrix. And so inside the matrix, we have our second step, which is the oxidation of pyruvate. And the third step, which is the citric acid cycle. And then remember, step 4 is the oxidative phosphorylation, which includes the electron transport chain and chemiosmosis. And so for our fourth one, that oxidative phosphorylation, what happens is you actually have materials that are going from the matrix, so we'll draw it over here, from the matrix out to the intermembrane space, but then other stuff going from the intermembrane space back into the matrix. And so oxidative phosphorylation actually happens kind of across the cristae of that intermembrane space, or I'm sorry, of the intermembrane of the mitochondria. So let's start by taking a look at our first kind of set of reactions known as glycolysis. Now, glycolysis itself is actually an anaerobic process. So remember, anaerobic means without oxygen. So we do not need oxygen to occur. Now, not to confuse you, because we're talking about aerobic respiration here. So we're talking about making ATP in the presence of oxygen. So why are we talking about this process that is anaerobic and does not require oxygen? So remember when we talked about these reactions of cellular respiration, we talked about how there are two pathways. So we have the aerobic pathway and we have the anaerobic pathway. And remember, the aerobic pathway we said requires oxygen, and the anaerobic pathway does not require oxygen. And then we listed the kind of the main steps of these pathways. And the first pathway, or the first set of reactions in both of these, was glycolysis. So glycolysis itself is actually an anaerobic pathway, but it's the start of both the aerobic and anaerobic reactions. What happens after that is where things actually start to differ. Now, glycolysis occurs in the cytoplasm, so we do not need a mitochondria in order for glycolysis to occur. So mitochondrion is not needed in order for glycolysis to occur. We don't need the mitochondria until we get to these later steps of aerobic respiration. Now, if we look at the word glycolysis, we can actually break it down into glyco and lysis. And glyco is the kind of like a prefix having to do with sugars. So think of things like glycogen, glycocalyx. These are all things that are related to sugars. And then we know from learning about hydrolysis reactions that lysis means to break something. So the term glycolysis actually means to break sugar. All right, so it means to break sugar. And that's exactly what happens during this chemical reaction. We're going to start by looking at our glucose, which is our C6H12O6, which is a sugar. And we are going to break that sugar down into something else to get these reactions started. So we're going to start by looking at the reactions of glycolysis. Now, as you can see from the image, there are several kind of like intermediate reactions that happen between the beginning and the end of glycolysis. And this image doesn't even show all of them. There are, I think, about a dozen reactions that happen between glucose going into the reactions and pyruvate coming out. So we're going to look at kind of the big picture. So what is the overall input or reactants? And then what is the overall output from these glycolysis reactions? So as we go through glycolysis and the oxidation of pyruvate and the citric acid cycle and oxidative phosphorylation, we're going to be tracking kind of three main components. So the first main component is going to be the carbon-based compounds. And so I'm going to use the color black because carbon is found in coal. And so whenever I think of carbon, I think of black. So we're going to start by looking at a 6-carbon molecule, starting with glucose. So remember that glucose, the chemical formula is C6H12O6. We're going to primarily focus on the carbon. So we're just going to say that this is a 6-carbon molecule. Now, the end result is that 6-carbon molecule gets cut in half, and we end up with 2 3-carbon molecules called pyruvate. You might also see this called pyruvic acid. That's the same name. It's just 2 different names for the same molecule. But notice how we start out with 6, we end up with 2 3-carbon pyruvate molecules. So I know it's going to be kind of hard to see on this dark background, so let me switch over to the white pen real quick. So glucose is our 6-carbon compound, and we end up with 2 3-carbon pyruvates. Additionally, during these reactions, we have some of those redox reactions happening. And so what happens is as glucose gets split up into pyruvate, some electrons get transferred from the carbon molecules to this molecule known as NAD+. And it converts it to something called NADH. And so as you can see over in the diagram here, what happens is that electrons get picked up during these redox reactions. So I actually like to draw some little dots next to the NADH to remind myself that there are electrons that have been picked up by this molecule. In addition to these electron carriers, so NADH is an electron carrier, remember? So we'll talk about why that is important when we talk about the later stages of aerobic respiration. But in addition to these electron carriers, we are also looking at our ATP, ADP kind of reversible reaction happening. Now, in glycolysis, we actually have to have a little bit of an input in energy in order to get the reaction started. So we actually have to put 2 ATP into the reaction to start breaking that glucose. And so we can think of this as kind of like a -2 for ATP because you have to invest some ATP to get things started. But in the end, we end up making 4 ATP. So we can think of this as a +4. So even though we have to invest or put in 2 ATP, we ultimately get 4 ATP out. As we mentioned on the previous slide, we have to put 2 ATP into the process to get glycolysis started, but we ultimately get 4 ATP out. So if we look at net, so net ATP production, net means what is the profit? So how much did we get after we account for the fact that we had to use 2 ATP to start the process? So we make 4 ATP, but we had to use 2 in order to get it started. So ultimately, the process of glycolysis produces 2 ATP molecules. And this process is called substrate level phosphorylation. And this is different from the oxidative phosphorylation that we're going to talk about a little bit later, which requires the electron transport chain. All right, so this is not oxidative phosphorylation. This is called substrate level phosphorylation. So we talked about how during glycolysis we made some NADH. And so NAD plus was reduced to form NADH. And remember, we drew those 2 little dots on NADH to remind us that it had picked up some electrons along the way. So did NAD plus gain or lose electrons? And we can go back and remember our mnemonic, and we can say that NAD plus was, remember, oxidation is loss, reduction is gain. So NAD plus was reduced, meaning that it gained electrons to form NADH. And I'll add those 2 little electron dots on there. So if we look at the products or the outcomes or the outputs of glycolysis, what happens to those? So why do we care about the ADP, the NADH, and the pyruvate? So first of all, ATP, remember, is just energy. So we've already made some energy that the cell can use. Now we could stop there, but we could get a lot more ATP out of that glucose molecule if we kept going. And we'll talk about how that happens on the following slides. The NADH, remember, is an electron transporter, and it's got those electrons, and it's going to transport those electrons to the electron transport chain. So we're going to talk about this NADH more in a little while. So right now, just kind of keep it in the back of your head that this NADH is hanging out, holding on to some electrons for us. And then last but not least, we've got our pyruvate, which is our 3-carbon compound. And remember, we actually have 2 of these because remember we had a 6-carbon glucose that got broken down into 2 3-carbon pyruvates. Now, this carbon compound of pyruvate, we can still get some more energy out of it. And so that pyruvate is going to keep going through the additional stages of aerobic respiration in order to allow us to make some more ATP. And remember that glycolysis actually occurs for both aerobic and anaerobic respiration. So the fate of glucose depends on whether there is oxygen present or whether there isn't. And so we're going to talk about what that pyruvate does if we have oxygen or if we don't. Now, you're probably familiar with the fact that humans have to breathe. If we stop breathing, we die. But have you ever stopped to think about why that is the case? Why do we have to breathe? We know that we have to inhale to take in oxygen. But why do we need oxygen? Well, we need oxygen in order to make ATP using that aerobic pathway. All right, so we have to breathe in to get oxygen into our body because we need that oxygen to go through the oxidation of pyruvate, the citric acid cycle, and oxidative phosphorylation. Without those, the pyruvate would have to go through the anaerobic stages, and we'll find out at the end that the anaerobic pathway is just not as efficient as the aerobic pathway. So that oxygen allows us to get a much greater return on investment with regards to how much ATP we can make per molecule of glucose than the anaerobic pathway. Right? So we need that oxygen, and more specifically, we need that oxygen to make ATP. Now, exhaling is also really important because remember that we looked at the overall equation of cellular respiration, and we said that you had to have some sort of organic molecule. In our case, we're talking about glucose, plus some oxygen in order for that to occur. Now, the end products of cellular respiration include carbon dioxide, water, and energy in the form of ATP. So the main reason why we exhale is actually to get rid of this carbon dioxide. So some carbon dioxide dissolved in your body fluids is actually a good thing. You need some in there, but your cells are constantly making more of it. And if your carbon dioxide level gets too high, it can actually cause problems, including something called acidosis. And so you'll learn about that more when you get into acid-base balance in anatomy and physiology type classes. Most people use the terms breathing and respiration interchangeably, as if they mean the same thing. But in reality, they actually have different definitions to them. So breathing refers to basically moving air in and out of your body and gas exchange between things like your lungs and your blood vessels and between blood vessels and the cells. So breathing is really just moving air between different areas kind of in your body and exchanging that air with the external environment. Respiration refers to the cells actually using that oxygen to extract energy from those organic molecules. And I say oxygen, but we can make ATP, we can do anaerobic respiration without oxygen. So respiration really just means that cells are extracting energy from organic molecules, whether oxygen is involved or not. So remember that breathing is just moving respiratory gases like oxygen and carbon dioxide in and out of your body, whereas cellular respiration is actually taking those organic compounds and extracting energy from them to make ATP. All right, so we've talked about how during glycolysis we make this molecule known as pyruvate. So now let's assume that we have oxygen. So what's going to happen to this pyruvate? Remember, pyruvate is this 3-carbon compound. So it's got 3 carbons in it. Well, pyruvate is going to go through the remaining steps of cellular respiration. So it's going to go through the oxidation of pyruvate, which is also called the transition reaction, the citric acid cycle, which is also called the Krebs cycle, although that term is starting to become kind of older and not being used anymore. And then last but not least, it's going to go through oxidative phosphorylation, which involves the electron transport chain followed by chemiosmosis. Now, in addition to needing oxygen, these steps also require mitochondria in order to occur. So we're going to be talking about the specific areas of the mitochondria where these different reactions occur and why that's important. All right, so after pyruvate is made during glycolysis, it moves into the matrix, which is that kind of gooey filled center of the mitochondrion, in order to go through the remaining steps of aerobic respiration. Now, for each glucose molecule that goes into glycolysis, we end up having 2 pyruvates because remember, glucose is a 6-carbon compound that gets broken up into 2 3-carbon pyruvates. So we've got 2 pyruvate molecules that are going to go through the oxidation of pyruvate. So looking at the overall reactants and products of the oxidation of pyruvate reactions, first let's take a look at our carbon compound pyruvate. So remember, pyruvate is a 3-carbon compound, and it starts out by combining with something called coenzyme A, which we abbreviate as CoA. And what happens is it ends up making a 2-carbon compound called acetyl-CoA, or acetyl coenzyme A, plus carbon dioxide, and carbon dioxide of course has 1 carbon in it. So we've taken 3 carbons in pyruvate, and we've broken one of those carbons off into carbon dioxide, and then we've made this 2-carbon molecule known as acetyl-CoA. Additionally, we've made some additional NADH. So NAD plus picks up some electrons to make NADH. And once again, I'm going to draw those little dots there to remind myself that the NADH is carrying some electrons. So the NAD plus was reduced in order to form NADH. So NAD plus gained, remember reduction is gain, so NAD plus gained electrons in order to form NADH. Note that no ATP is made in this process here, but it's still important to happen because the acetyl-CoA is going to go into the citric acid cycle in order to allow us to make more ATP. And the NADH, with its electrons that it's carrying, it's going to go into the electron transport chain, which is going to help us make more ATP. So this specific set of reactions does not produce ATP, but it produces compounds or molecules that we're going to be able to get ATP from further along in these chemical reactions. So looking at the kind of the product or some of the products of the oxidation of pyruvate, what do you think happens to the carbon dioxide? Hopefully you guessed that we just exhale it for the most part. So it first goes into the bloodstream, and then if we have too much carbon dioxide building up in the bloodstream, we're going to exhale it to get it out of the body. The next question is what happens to the NADH? Remember that NADH is an electron carrier, so it's going to carry electrons to the electron transport chain, which we abbreviate as the ETC. So this is the electron transport chain.